I've been doing leadership training for over 40 years, either part-time or full-time. And usually in the beginning of my presentation, I give a bio. And one of the things I mention in my biographical information is that I've been doing leadership training for 40 years. But then I always add this. And I said, and I've been doing this leadership training for 40 years, and it doesn't work. And to watch the expression on people's faces who are sitting in a leadership training class, it's very interesting, their response. But I believe that after doing this for 40 years, and a friend of mine asked me one time sarcastically, he said, how long have you been doing leadership training? And at that point, it had been over 30 years. And sarcastically, he said, do you help anybody? And instantly, I said, no. He said, well, I'm just kidding. I said, well, I'm not. He said, you really do believe that what you do doesn't help anybody? I said, basically, yes, that's a true statement. Leadership training doesn't work. And I think it's important that as we discuss leadership and the lack of leadership, so what's the solution? And then when people say leadership training, the reality is we're going to talk about in this short message why it doesn't tend to change people. And I've had people throughout all of these years come up to me and say that my boss came to your class, loved it, encouraged us to come. And as I sat here in class, I agree with what you're saying, but my boss who recommended this class doesn't do any of these things. He violates every principle you're teaching. And I want all the listeners to think about this, that how many of you, all of you, I would assume, have seen somebody attend a leadership training course. And it could have been a week long, or it could have been 14 weeks long, or a day long. But did it change them? And training means to transform. It doesn't mean to give information. It means that you change people. Education means information, but training means to transform people. And so the question I have, and I always ask this in class as well, I said, how many of you known people have gone to leadership training? Even the FBI National Academy, which is an excellent course, did they change that much after they went through the course? Are they like awesome? And all you can think about is how much better there are at that. And you can see their humorous responses. And because the reason that they think this is funny, because basically the same person came back. He or she went to all this training and come back, and they're still doing the same mistakes when it comes to leading people. And I was introduced early on this, and I want to just share kind of a progression of stories. I started doing leadership training in 1984. I was only 33 years old. I was picked because I had a law enforcement background to teach in the Georgia program for law enforcement supervisors, and then another one for managers and another one for executives. Now, what's interesting is I'd only been a first-line supervisor, but still, that was my job. And for a full-time job for about 6 or 7 years, I taught leadership. Well, the first classes they did were for first-line supervisors, and I did that. And then I was getting ready to do my first management level training course. And when I walked into class, I looked in the back of the room, and what did I see but the worst captain and the two worst lieutenants I ever worked for when I was a police officer. They were legends of how bad they were. No one wanted to work for them. They embarrassed people in front of everybody. They were terrible. And so I've got them sitting in the back of the room. They're waving at me, saying, it was good to see you, Jack. It's good to see you. And I'm going, oh my gosh. The worst managers I ever worked for are sitting in class on leadership. And I walked out of the classroom, and the coordinator saw that something was going on. He said, are you okay? I said, no, the three worst managers I ever worked for in the class. He said, so what's the problem? I said, half of my illustrations are sitting in the room. And he started laughing. He said, but you don't use people's names. I said, but they're going to know I'm talking about them. And I said, then on top of that, they're going to argue with me on every principle on communication's important, being fair, caring for your people. I said, they're going to fight me the entire day. And during the next 8 hours, I got a fascinating education in human nature. One, non-verbally, it was clear they loved the class. They were nodding in agreement as I went over all of these principles that they violated on a regular basis. And then they came up at the break, and I was obviously a little bit defensive when they walked up, but it was interesting what they said. This is great. This is such great training. But then they said something to add on to that. I wished the sergeant had to go through this training. There's a bunch of lieutenants that should be here today. And they started talking about who else needed to be there. And that was an experience that I would see for the next 40 years, that training law enforcement managers and supervisors and leadership, that most managers are failing, but everybody loves leadership training. So think about this for a minute. If you're doing training on firearms and a person is very ineffective in his or her firearms skills, when they come to class, they're going to have a certain freak factor going on. They're going to be nervous and agitated because they know I can't do this very well. You would see it on their faces, and you'd also obviously see it on the range, but they would be afraid to be in this class. But here's an interesting statistic. Over the last 25 years, I've asked people what percentage of managers are failing. The consistent answer I've had to that is about 90%. Some say 80, but the number one answer I've heard is what percentage of your managers and supervisors have been leaders? The number one number I've heard for all these years is 10%. So 90% of managers are failing, and yet, so when I have a class of 50 people, statistically 90% of them are failing. But when I look at the nonverbal behavior as we go through the material, they love it. They're nodding, they're grinning. So clearly they're enjoying this class. But in the beginning, all of them are saying that 90% of managers are failing. So are the only people I have in class are the ones who are leaders? Then they come up at the break, and like that captain and two lieutenants, they make the same kind of comments. And I want you to think about this. After 40 years of this, I probably had 1,000 people come up to me at the break. And this is generally how they make a comment about the training. This is great training. I'm enjoying it a lot. But then there's a but. But, man, I wish the chiefs had to go through this training. And normally those are the first line supervisors saying that. Then when I train the chiefs and sheriffs, guess what they come up and say at the break? I wish sergeants had to go through this training. So every comment, pretty much, I would say plus 90%, come up to me, say, I love the training, but somebody else needs to be here. I wish somebody else had to go through this training. And I can honestly say this, in 40 years of training, I probably had less than 24 people come up to me and say, you kicked my butt today. You said the number 2 complaint against leaders is they don't communicate. And it hit me that I have 10 employees and I haven't talked to 8 of them probably in a month. I'm too busy in my office, and shame on me. No, that is so rare. I never forget those encounters. What I always remember is the normal ones that come up and say, I wished the captains had to go through this training. It's always somebody else. And so that didn't make any sense. And so fortunately for me, after 9/11, I got recalled active duty for a year, and they recalled me to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Brunswick, Georgia. This is a massive training facility, a former, I believe, naval base that I was sent to for a year as my obligation for the Navy. And I'm sitting in an office surrounded by, again, a very professional training center. And in that training center, they had a driver's training track where people had to learn how to drive tactically, safely, and at high rates of speed. And you would pass that track, and here's vehicles speeding and doing 180s and all that other stuff. There was also obviously a firing ranges there, and you would hear gunfire all the time and people shooting at different distances. You also saw other things like the former barracks. They would be making tactical entries through the door, and then once inside, after they secured the premises, the instructors had hidden, quote, drugs or packages for them to find, to teach them how to search for drugs in an apartment or house that they had successfully entered. And I noticed there was always a lot of role players, like there were, quote, drug people inside these small apartments. And then I noticed one day, and one of my favorite memories was I was going to eat lunch and I noticed there was a pond across the street. And as I got out of my car, I looked over and there was a guy in a Redman outfit, the big padded outfit, fishing. And this is in the middle of summer in South Georgia. And I started laughing because I knew he wasn't fishing. He was a role player. And I watched it for a minute. And sure enough, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife car drove up and a person got out of the driver's side that was a trainee, and an evaluator got out the right side of the vehicle with a clipboard. And I knew what was about to happen. There's going to be a butt kicking on the side of that pond to test, notice that word, to test, did that person learn from the training how to do this? And so this was a test of, can you implement what we taught in the classroom, what we demonstrated, you practice now in a real kind of environment that you would face in the middle of nowhere in Montana. I'm going to see if you can deal with a mentally disturbed person who's probably going to go off on you. So here's the point. For a year, I'm in this training center, and then it hit me one day. It was a kind of a gotcha moment. There was only one facility on that entire massive area that was not a training facility. It was the Management Sciences building where I had taught for years, which is where they teach leadership. There are no practical applications. There is nothing but classrooms and people sitting, listening to presentations. Instead of a tell, see, do format, which most training is involved in that three-step process, this was a tell environment. This was more like a college class than the other components of training that was going on at FLETC. And then it was a light bulb went off on why everybody loves leadership training and why they always wish somebody else could be there attending the training. And when I got off of active duty, I decided to make up a new slide for my PowerPoint presentation. And about halfway through my presentation, I had this slide there. And this is what basically it said. A young sergeant comes up to you and says, I want to be an effective sergeant. This is my first promotion. And I've noticed since I've been at this agency, there's not a lot of leadership. Most managers fail. Why do you think most managers fail to apply leadership in their roles as supervisors and managers? And I said, this is your response. And the PowerPoint has a sentence that is not finished. It's in quotes, and it says this. This is what, and I'm telling the class people, the class members, I said, I want you to finish the sentence. Most managers fail because, and then there's ... And I said, finish the sentence that you would tell this young sergeant. Most managers fail basically to lead because, list the reason. And I said, I am requiring every one of you to finish the sentence on what wisdom would you pass down to this young supervisor?
As a practical, why don't you finish this sentence, either in writing or say it to yourself? Most managers fail to practice leadership skills because